Madison Square Garden, November 28, 1974. 20,000 people held their breath. Elton John was at the piano, sweat dripping down his face, his sequined jumpsuit catching every spotlight in the arena. He had just finished playing one of the biggest shows of his career. The crowd was roaring, but Elton wasn't looking at them. He was looking at the wings of the stage, waiting, because tonight wasn't just about him. Tonight was about a bet, a promise made months ago in a recording studio. A promise that John Lennon, the Beatle, the legend, had never expected to keep. And now, as the crowd's cheers echoed through the arena, Elton saw a figure emerge from the shadows. John Lennon walked onto the stage. Nobody in that building knew they were watching history. Nobody knew that this would be the last time John Lennon would ever perform live. Not Elton, not the band, not even Lennon himself. 6 years later he would be dead. But on this night, in this moment, two friends were about to share a stage. And the story of how they got there is one of music's greatest untold tales. To understand that night at Madison Square Garden, you have to go back to the beginning, to a time when Elton John was the biggest star in the world, and John Lennon was trying to figure out who he was without the Beatles. It was 1973. The Beatles had been broken up for 3 years. John Lennon was living in New York City, separated from Yoko Ono, drinking too much, making music that critics called unfocused. The press had a name for this period of his life, the lost weekend. It would last 18 months. Lennon was lost, angry, searching for something he couldn't name, and then he met Elton John. They were introduced at a party in Los Angeles. Elton, 26 years old, was at the peak of his powers. He had just released Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, a double album that would become one of the best-selling records of all time. He was flamboyant, outrageous, wearing platform shoes and glasses shaped like stars. Everything John Lennon wasn't. But something clicked between them. Maybe it was because they were both outsiders who had clawed their way to the top. Maybe it was because they both understood the loneliness that came with fame. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe they just made each other laugh. John was the funniest person I'd ever met, Elton would later say. He could be cutting, brutal even, but underneath all that he was the most vulnerable man in the room. They started spending time together, recording together, and somewhere along the way they became genuine friends. But what nobody knew, what even Elton didn't fully understand at the time, was that John Lennon was terrified. Here's something most people don't know about John Lennon in 1974. He hadn't performed live in almost 3 years. The last time Lennon had been on a concert stage was August 1972, at Madison Square Garden for a charity show. Before that, the Beatles' final concert had been in 1966, 8 years earlier. For a man who had once played to screaming crowds around the world, John Lennon had become something unexpected. He had become afraid of the stage. The idea of performing live terrified him, a friend recalled. He would talk about it sometimes, late at night. The pressure, the expectation, being a Beatle had nearly destroyed him, and he wasn't sure he could handle that again. Lennon had built walls around himself. He made records, gave interviews, wrote songs, but the stage, that was different. The stage was where you couldn't hide, where every flaw was visible, where you had to face the audience and hope they still loved you. John Lennon wasn't sure they would. And then Elton John asked him a question that would change everything. It started in the summer of. Lennon was working on a new album called Walls and Bridges at the record plant in New York. He had written a song, an upbeat, driving track that didn't sound like anything he had done before. It was called Whatever Gets You Through the Night. But something was missing. The song needed energy. It needed someone who could match Lennon's intensity, push him further. And Lennon knew exactly who to call. Elton arrived at the studio on a hot July evening. He was wearing a bright yellow suit and sunglasses shaped like palm trees. Lennon, in jeans and a plain t-shirt, just shook his head and laughed. "You look like a bloody tropical storm," Lennon said. "And you look like you need someone to wake this song up," Elton replied. They got to work. Elton sat at the piano, listening to the track. Then he started playing, adding harmonies, layering his voice over Lennon's, injecting the song with the kind of explosive energy that had made him famous. The chemistry was immediate, but what happened next would become legend. At some point during the session, Elton turned to Lennon with a challenge. "This song is going to be a #1 hit," Elton said. Lennon laughed. Actually laughed out loud. "I haven't had a #1 since the Beatles," he said. "It's not going to happen." Elton smiled. "Want to? What kind of bet?" "If this song hits #1, you have to come perform it with me, live, on stage." The room went quiet. Everyone there knew what Elton was asking. He was asking John Lennon to face his greatest fear, to step back into the spotlight, to be a performer again. Lennon stared at him for a long moment. "You're out of your mind," he said finally. "But fine. It's a bet. Because there's no way in hell this song is going #1. They shook hands. And John Lennon had no idea what he had just agreed to. Whatever Gets You Through the Night was released in September 9. At first it seemed like Lennon might be right. The song debuted at number 52 on the Billboard charts. Respectable, but hardly a smash. Lennon probably felt relieved. The bet was just a joke after all. Elton would understand. But then something happened. The song started climbing. Week after week it moved up the charts. 52 became 40. 40 became 25. Radio stations couldn't stop playing it. The driving beat, the catchy chorus, Elton's backing vocals, everything came together. By late October, the song was in the top 10. Lennon started to get nervous. "He called me," Elton remembered. "He said, 'You bastard. This thing might actually do it.' And I said, 'John, a bet's a bet. Start practicing.'" On November 16, 1974, Whatever Gets You Through the Night hit #1 on the Billboard Hot 100. It was John Lennon's first and only solo #1 single in the United States during his lifetime, and now he owed Elton John a performance. Elton was in the middle of his tour when the news came. He was scheduled to play Madison Square Garden on November 28, Thanksgiving night, the biggest show of the tour, sold out months in advance. He picked up the phone and called Lennon. "It's time." There was silence on the other end. "John? You there? I can't do it," Lennon said quietly. "Elton, I haven't been on stage in years. I'll freeze. I'll forget the words. You'll be brilliant." Elton interrupted. "Because you're John Lennon, and because I'll be right there with you." More silence. "What if they don't want me anymore?" Lennon asked, and in that moment, Elton heard something he had never heard from his friend before. Fear. Pure, naked fear. "John," Elton said slowly, "they've never stopped wanting you. They've been waiting. All you have to do is show up." Lennon took a breath, then another. "All right," he said finally. "All right. But if I throw up on stage, I'm blaming you." Elton laughed. "Deal." The date was set. John Lennon would perform at Madison Square Garden on November, but he asked Elton for one favor. "Don't tell anyone he's coming." He wanted it to be a surprise. He wanted to walk out and see the crowd's reaction without any warning, without any hype. Just a man and his music, facing an audience for the first time in years. Elton agreed. And so as the day approached, only a handful of people in the world knew what was about to happen. November 28, 1974. New York City was cold. The kind of cold that cuts through your coat and settles in your bones. But inside Madison Square Garden, 20,000 people were generating their own heat. Elton John took the stage in a costume that defied description. A sequined baseball uniform, platform boots, glasses studded with diamonds. The crowd erupted. For 2 hours he gave them everything he had. Hit after hit. Benny and the Jets, Crocodile Rock, Rocket Man. The energy in the arena was electric. But backstage in a small dressing room, John Lennon was falling apart. He was pacing, smoking cigarette after cigarette. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the light. "I can't do this," he kept saying. "I can't do this." Tony King, a mutual friend, was there with him. "John, listen to me. You're going to be fine. Just go out there and..." "You don't understand," Lennon said. "Out there I'm supposed to be a Beatle. I'm supposed to be some kind of god. But I'm just me. What if that's not enough anymore?" The minutes ticked by. On stage, Elton was wrapping up his main set. The moment was approaching, and then something unexpected happened. A roadie knocked on the door. "Mr. Lennon, there's someone here to see you." The door opened, and standing there, wrapped in a winter coat, was Yoko Ono. Lennon and Yoko had been separated for over a year. Their reconciliation was still weeks away, but somehow she knew, somehow she understood that John needed her tonight. They didn't say much. She just took his hand and held it. "Go," she said simply. "They're waiting for you." John Lennon took a breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the stage. Elton had just finished his encore. The crowd was on their feet, screaming for more. The lights were hot, the noise deafening. Elton stood at the microphone, sweat pouring down his face, and raised his hand for silence. "I have a friend here tonight," he said. "Someone very special, and he's agreed to sing a few songs with me." The crowd buzzed with curiosity. Who could it be? "Please welcome John Lennon." For a moment, nothing, and then from the wings a figure emerged into the spotlight. John Lennon, thin, nervous, dressed simply in a black jacket and jeans. The crowd's reaction was unlike anything Elton had ever experienced. It wasn't just cheering. It was a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. 20,000 people, screaming, crying, reaching toward the stage. Lennon stopped, just stopped, and stared. Later he would describe what he felt in that moment. "It was like being hit by a wave," he said. "All that love, all that energy, just washing over me. I thought I was going to pass out." But he didn't pass out. He walked to the microphone, and then in a voice that trembled with emotion, he said, "I want to thank Elton and the boys for having me here tonight. We're going to do some numbers together and I hope you enjoy them." The crowd roared again. Elton looked over at his friend. Lennon's eyes were wet, but he was smiling. They launched into Whatever Gets You Through the Night. For the next 15 minutes, magic happened. John Lennon and Elton John performed 3 songs together. First, the song that had started it all, "The Bet," "The Promise," the #1 hit that had brought Lennon back to the stage. Lennon's voice was strong, confident. All the fear, all the doubt, seemed to melt away under the lights. He was John Lennon again, not the troubled artist, not the ex-Beatle trying to find himself, just a man doing what he was born to do. After Whatever Gets You Through the Night, they played Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, Elton's recent cover of the Beatles' classic, with Lennon himself on guitar. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a Beatle, reclaiming his own music, sharing it with a new generation. And then, for the final song, Lennon requested something special. "I'd like to do a song," he said into the microphone, "from an old estranged fiancé of mine called Paul." The crowd laughed. They knew what was coming. "I Saw Her Standing There," a Beatles song, one of the first they'd ever recorded. And now on this stage, John Lennon was singing it with Elton John, while 20,000 people sang along. In that moment, something healed. Years of Beatles drama, years of lawsuits, and bitter words and broken friendships. None of it mattered. What mattered was the music. What mattered was this room full of people, united by 3 songs and 2 men at a piano. When it was over, Lennon hugged Elton on stage. Then he turned to the crowd one last time, waved and walked off into the wings. He never performed live again. That night changed John Lennon. Backstage he found Yoko waiting for him. Whatever happened between them in those moments, it sparked something. Within weeks they had reconciled. Within months, they were expecting their son Sean. Lennon retreated from public life. He became a house husband, raising his son, baking bread, watching the world go by from his apartment in the Dakota building. The man who had been terrified of the stage found peace in its absence. Madison Square Garden was the end of something, he said in one of his final interviews. But it was also the beginning. Elton gave me that. He made me face my fear, and somehow that freed me. For 5 years, John Lennon was happy, truly, genuinely happy. And then December 8, 1980, happened. Elton John was in Australia when he got the news. It was early morning, local time. He was asleep in his hotel room when the phone rang. Groggy, disoriented, he picked it up. It was his manager, and from the tone of his voice, Elton knew immediately that something was wrong. "John Lennon's been shot," the manager said. "He's dead." Elton didn't speak, couldn't speak. The details came in fragments. Mark David Chapman, the Dakota, Yoko's screams, the blood on the sidewalk. John Lennon, his friend, his collaborator, the man who had walked out of the wings at Madison Square Garden just 6 years earlier, was gone. "I went numb," Elton said later. "I couldn't process it. John was the most alive person I'd ever known. The idea that someone could just take that away, it didn't make sense. It still doesn't." The days that followed were a blur. Tributes poured in from around the world. Vigils formed outside the Dakota. Radio stations played nothing but Beatles songs and Lennon's solo work. But for Elton, the grief was personal. He kept thinking about that night at Madison Square Garden, about the fear in John's voice before he went on stage, about the joy in his eyes when the crowd roared. "I'm so glad we made that bet," Elton said, because John got to feel that love one more time. He got to know that they still wanted him, and if that night was going to be his last performance, at least it was a good one. 2 years after Lennon's death, Elton released a song. It was called Empty Garden. Hey Hey Johnny, a tribute to his fallen friend. Written with Bernie Taupin, the lyrics spoke of a gardener who had tended his garden with care, only to leave it behind too soon. Elton performed the song at Madison Square Garden, the same arena where he and Lennon had shared the stage 8 years earlier. During the performance, something unexpected happened. As Elton sang, Yoko Ono appeared from the wings with 9-year-old John Lennon. They stood at the side of the stage, watching, tears streaming down their faces. The crowd saw them. The applause that followed was deafening, a standing ovation that lasted for minutes. It was as if for one moment, John Lennon's spirit was there in the room with them. "That was one of the most emotional nights of my life," Elton said afterward. He looked so much like John, and I thought about all the things John would never see. Sean growing up, the world changing, his own songs still playing everywhere. The garden wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memory. Why does that night at Madison Square Garden still matter 50 years later? Because it reminds us that even legends are human. John Lennon, the man who had changed music forever, was afraid of failure, afraid of rejection, afraid of stepping back into the spotlight and being found wanting. And it took a friend in a sequined baseball uniform and diamond-studded glasses, to push him past that fear. "Elton saved me that night," Lennon said, "not just my career. He made me remember why I started doing this in the first place." The bet was supposed to be a joke, a throwaway moment between friends in a recording studio, but it became something more. It became John Lennon's last gift to the world. 15 minutes of pure, joyful music, 3 songs that nobody who was there would ever forget. And it became a reminder that sometimes the greatest moments in life come from the things we're most afraid to do. Elton John is 78 years old now. He's retired from touring, living quietly with his husband David and their 2 sons. He's won every award there is to win. He's been knighted, honored, celebrated. But when interviewers ask him about the highlights of his career, he always mentions that night. November 20, Madison Square Garden, John Lennon. He pauses, and even after all these years, there's still something in his eyes, something between joy and grief. "I'm so grateful I got to share that stage with him," Elton says. "I'm grateful for the friendship, for the music, for everything he taught me about being brave." He looks away, takes a breath. "I just wish we'd had more time." We all do. John Lennon walked off the stage at Madison Square Garden on November 20th, but for 15 minutes, on a cold Thanksgiving night. 2 friends reminded the world why music matters, why connection matters, why taking a chance on something terrifying can lead to something beautiful, and that in the end is what gets us through the night.